Hmm.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Feel free to take a few moments to look around, see who's with us
Always
this week.
such a happy moment. Happy moments.
Great.
Mm. So many time zones. So good to see you all. Great. Hmm. Hmm. It's a great practice sitting down and being mindful of seeing, kind of taking in the colors and the feeling in our hearts and mind connecting. Letting your attention connect with everybody, and then gradually kind of shifting to connecting to your body sitting here, the sitting posture. You might notice the air element, the breath coming and going. And we might start with a bit of metta, karuna, just tuning into some kindness and care for yourself. You can put your hand on your heart center. I'll stand up if you find it helpful, just connecting with yourself that way. I think sometimes there can just be a big relief to settle into your bodies. Include the heart center. And at the least, making an intention to be kind with whatever appears during the sitting. And this is a kind of choiceless love. Choiceless meaning there are no conditions. Whatever experience appears in our body, in our mind, any thought, any emotion. Sometimes it requires the attention to kind of settle back a bit, not trying too hard, not giving up, but a kind of just settling in with some ease. Or you will intend to care about any pain that comes up. Be kind to whatever appears or with. And sometimes when we shift to the Vipassana and feel our hands touching, either one hand on another hand or on our thighs. You can just see where bringing a little kindness or care in there often will help us connect more with things as they are. So there's a kind of shift into from that choiceless love to that understanding that it doesn't matter what our experience is, moment by moment. But the intention is to be with what is happening, just as it is, without conditions, that choiceless freedom, not needing to control what's happening, but to connect with what's happening just as it is. So knowing, also bringing in that understanding that all we need is already within us. The attention again can kind of settle in, settle back. And from this place of ease, of well-being, receiving the sensations in our hands, the life of our body, the aliveness. And just taking the time, not being in a hurry. With the greatest tenderness for the preciousness of life itself. And the word hand or finger, palm, thumb might arise. The mind is made up of thoughts and stories. No need to have a problem with it. We can just notice that thinking is happening in the present moment and returning to this emerging, this wordless emerging of sensations in our hand. Moment to moment, change. You might notice that the movement of the breath at your abdomen is very close by to these sensations in our hands. So we don't have to yank the attention there. It's just a kind of settling in there. maybe with some awe or wonder. We're so dependent on this movement. We so don't control it. And again, getting that sense of it's easy to have a word breath or think we know what the breath is. That's very easy. Finding that relationship with this movement of tenderness, kindness, with no need to control it. We see if the attention can connect just with it happening, just as it's happening. Receiving these sensations directly, not through the thought process. If you can do that just once, try to be with that rising movement just as it's happening. That's enough. Maybe we shift to the hands for a while and then try a falling movement. And we can see when we're right with that movement, the thoughts tend to fade into the background or disappear. And just like we hear sounds, we'll hear our stories in the mind coming and going, just like the sounds. You might notice the spaces in between. And if sounds are present, predominant, you just receive the sounds directly through the ear door or vibrations, textures, maybe within our bodies, surface of body or through the ears. Stories about the sounds might come and go. You come back to the awe and wonder of being able to receive the silence, the texture of silence, textures of sound. No need to control them, manipulate them, fix them. And with the emotion, same textures, vibrations that appear in our bodies with happiness, sadness, fear, compassion, peace, anger, loneliness, gratitude. No need to control them, but finding that anchoring if we're identified with any stories or thoughts about the experience. Coming back home to the breath, hands, or sound. With kindness and care and tenderness.
Thank you, Michelle. Hmm. Good to sit with you all. There's a particular sutta that I often come back to a lot just in my own memory and also teaching. I'll kind of quote it somewhat frequently, the Atadanda Sutta, and there's so much in it. There's many different kind of parts to it that I like to quote from, sometimes in general. But there's one part of it where the Buddha says, when he's speaking of an arahant or an enlightened being, someone who's completed their path of practice, he describes them as not harsh, not greedy, not perturbed, everywhere in tune. And I've just been kind of sitting with that notion of everywhere in tune and practicing and thinking about practice and feeling into more of the kind of daily life experiences in the mind and heart. And what does it mean to be everywhere in tune? What does it mean to feel out of tune, not in tune? What does that process look like? And we talk frequently also about this way of describing so much of the human experience as having this undercurrent of dissatisfaction, of kind of dissonance with what's happening. And, of course, many people these days, I think, are describing that in sort of monumental and apocalyptic terms. Of course, with everything going on in our on the bigger scale of our world, right? This sense of climate crisis and um, political crises everywhere, and so much violence and so much it can feel like the sort of shutting down of people's voices and democracy, and whether that's sort of on the big scale or in our communities or in our personal lives, and all of the big heightened tensions around race or class or gender or COVID dynamics, and um, this sense that there is an atmosphere of dissonance at large, right, that is maybe sort of shared by many. Um, and while obviously it's true, and at the same time, there is the sense of the personal experience of it, and and how different is it from a mind of 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 100 or 1,000 years ago, in the sense of persistent dissonance with our direct experience, this kind of tension with the fluctuation of life and the fluctuation of our experience at the six sense doors. And of course, this always this tension between aspiring to a peace and a love capacity for these things that's beyond conditions, and also knowing that conditions impact us. Conditions impact our ability to get free from conditions. And so there's this dance with this sort of sense of this atmosphere of tension, and then the experience of it, and where do we have the resources to build and strengthen the mind amid all of that? Where is tension something that the mind has the ability to grow from, and where does it become overwhelming to the point that it's just we shut down and we deepen our patterns? Um, habitual conditioned patterns that keep creating our sort of cycles of tension and suffering and hardship in our lives. The question of attunement, um, I think there's something very valuable in thinking about our lives kind of musically. And it was so much in this tradition, and in particular in Theravada Buddhism, um, and in particular the Abhidhamma influenced traditions in Burma and that we're more rooted in, where the experience of our senses, the experience of the mind and body, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, is often uh, oriented toward, in terms of our observation of it, in terms of momentary experiences, discrete experiences of sight, smell, taste, touch, mind, phenomena, body, mind, phenomena. and and yet this quality of music and a tone brings forth the other side of how we also experience life, which is more in the form of waves, right? More in the form of these sort of undulations, and science backs that up too, right? And it came up recently in some conversations and talks of this sense of that all things are really can be experienced as particles or as waves. And in Western music in particular, there is the kind of models and theories around dissonance and consonance in music in terms of wavelength, in terms of tone, this sense of where is there a relationship between two tones that feels stable, feels resolved, and where is there a relationship between two tones that feels like it builds tension, where there's a, a sort of this quality of dissonance, of dissatisfaction, of that inspires the mind to long for resolution, to consonance, to something that's more stable feeling, stable sounding to the mind. And it's very interesting. I don't pretend to know a lot of music theory. I've studied it like formally several times in my life in classes, and I've always forgotten it like very quickly. It doesn't sort of like stick, and never mind the sort of science behind these waves and frequency and amplitude and all these things. But suffice to say that it's understood that there are a few components around what causes the experience of feeling like two tones are dissonant or where they feel resolved. And one is biological, that there is something about frequency of waves that the mind has a harder time discerning. The mind is always trying to sort of discern relationships, and that there are certain frequencies that are harder to discern because of the ways that they interact. And then the second part of it is cultural, and in sort of every way, from the sense of that non-Western music has a lot of what um, can have a lot of different, depending on where it's from, uh, um, sound relationships, right? That might sound tense to a Western ear, but that sound perfectly normal and enjoyable to another ear, right? Um, but also this sense cultural in terms of mind culture that there is a tension with something that feels unfamiliar there, and that familiarity can build. Um, and so certain things that might sound dissonant at first start to become part of the palette of sound that people can become accustomed to um, and feel strengthened by and feel enjoy, right, in different ways. And so, of course, even in Western music, there's tension. It's built in often for effect, right? And this impulse to resolve it is there. And I think it's a very powerful metaphor, actually, for how we experience so much of our lives, how we go through our lives. Receiving these six streams of experience of undulating sound and body and smell and taste, touch, mind experiences, and where our preferences lie in relationship to those things, where what we want to be happening in relationship to what actually is happening. This question of whether we experience that as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral um, has a lot to do with this, and how powerful it is that of how much of our lives, if you're really honest and you're really sensitive to it in the momentary, normal going about one's day, how much of our lives we experience as dissonant, as unsatisfactory, of not quite just the way we want it to be, or that these moments where things are stable and the way we want them to be are also always changing, that they're undependable and they slip out from under us. And so there's the dissonance and the tension that arises from losing that which we feel as pleasant, which we feel as stable and connected. Right? These are the sense of dissonance is it's very much the way dukkha is described, right? The stress of being joined with the unpleasant, being separated from the pleasant, and not getting what we want, right? Having the sense of experiences at the sense stores, experiences in our lives that we strive towards, that we long for. And gosh, how this discomfort with dissonance, not just audio dissonance, but with the dissonance of our sense experience, the dissonance with what's happening in any given moment in our lives, even very subtly, how powerful the impulse to find relief, to find satisfaction, to find resolution, to come to resolution is um, throughout our day. That in some ways we can start to see it as really the primary driving force of a lot of our activity, a lot of our action, is the experience of dissonance and the longing to resolve it, the tension of discord with what's happening and wanting it to be over, right? Wanting what is unpleasant to be over with, and this sense of, on the unpleasant side of things, this sense of waiting, of like, oh, once this is done, I'll feel relieved. Once this is over, I'll feel relieved. This stress, this thing that is unpleasant in my life, once it passes, then I'll feel relieved. And how amazing and how poignant that perspective is. Because on one hand, there's truth to that, like that unpleasant things pass away and there is a sense of relief, but the stability of that relief is uh, very fleeting, right? You couldn't call it really stable at all. And the degree to which we are so desperate for relief from the unpleasant experience is also the degree to which we are not building a new story, building a new capacity, not able to grow from this relationship with the tension. Then there's the sense of relief of longing for a pleasant experience, right? Of like, oh, ambition in our lives, wanting something, wanting to achieve something, wanting to attain something, wanting to experience something, right? Even the most basic sense of subtle craving or wanting or desire, from the most extreme to the most subtle, the sense of, oh, once I get that, there will be this relief, there will be satisfaction, there will be a settling of the mind. And again, yes, there's something real in that, right? We don't deny that there is a satisfaction that comes from that. And yet, we also are very aware as yogis of how fleeting that is, and how dependence upon that satisfaction as resolution is not freedom, right? Not in its ultimate sense. That it's very poignant when we feel our dependency on pleasant experience in order to feel any sense of spaciousness or alleviation in the mind. And then the experience that is more in the realm of delusion is complex. Delusion in and of itself, in many ways, is designed to dull the intensity of the dissonance, fantasy, drunkenness, obliviousness, whatever ways that the mind or the body or we as beings might find to um, deaden the intensity of the dukkha, of the dissonance, is part of the function. It's part of what delusion serves as. And then in and of itself, of course, it can have its own unpleasant qualities, its sense of confusion, of unclarity, of indecisiveness, the perplexity, the tension, and the pain of that is the experience of dissonance in the mind in relationship to delusion. And of course, the wanting to just know, wanting the satisfaction of things being known and solidified and clear in that way, um, is again part of that longing of the heart. And so, of course, it has a lot to do, our lack of relationship with dissonance, our inability to bear the intensity of it, to understand what's happening, is what then ends up determining uh, so much of how we behave, right? The behavior of the mind culture that arises from that tends towards, right, the so-called defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion. That it ends up being that those are the predominant modes of relationship to sense experience that develop. And so you can see how understandable it is. You can see how understandable it is for when we are not able to see clearly, we're not able to distinguish clearly the relationship between two sounds, between the mind and an experience, between the wanting and the object. That this tension arises, right? We're not able to distinguish pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. We're not able to distinguish the sense experience from the aversion or the attachment or the delusion, that we are more subject to re-inspiring these things that actually end up creating more dissonance in our lives, more dissonance in our minds and bodies, more dissonance in the world, out of the desire for consonance, right? Out of the desire for um, resolution, relief, satisfaction. It's not it's not unlike story arcs, right? You just think of any, not any, most myths, uh, most of the way history is framed, most of the way we movies, novels, this idea of like some situation and tension arises, and and then this sort of seeking of resolution of that tension, right? That's very simple way of describing of course the complex way that humans have created these arcs of narrative and arcs of meaning. But you can see that there's something very deeply satisfying to our kind of archetypal selves around this idea that there's some stability, something changes through tension, there's a possibility for growth, and then the sort of classic like happily ever after notion, right? Which we all know to be fantasy, we all know to be ridiculous on some level, and yet we're very compelled by it. We keep watching the movies, we keep reading the stories, we keep framing our own lives and the lives of others and the history of the world in terms of these sort of arcs that come to conclusion, that come to a sense of resolve. And so we very actively reinforce these um, behaviors and patterns and beliefs in the possibility of resolution as a place of satisfaction, as a place of relief and rest, even though, of course, we've never actually experienced that. And we see that it's never actually led to that anywhere we can look. And so, we love those parts of human culture and our own. It's not to just dismiss or deny or reject them, There's a lot to be learned from them, and especially what are the conditions under which we can grow from tension? What are the conditions in which tension actually is just harmful and um, doesn't create the supportive context and container in which we might develop, right? What are the internal and external conditions that can lead, and some of that can be defined, some of that's very mysterious of how we show up in a situation, and then the tension and the dissonance with what's happening is something that we're able to grow from, and where is it times where we end up sort of deepening our patterns of addiction or violence or delusion, whatever it might be. But but it's important to get sensitized to the degree to which so much of our lives are being fueled by this tension. So much of our activity, so much of our actions is fueled by the tension of this dissonance with experience and with the desire for longing, desire and longing for resolution, for consonance, for stability, for the sort of satisfaction of that. It reminds me of a little I read recently about like one of the, I don't want to go on a huge tangent. One of the challenges around like solar power and stuff, right, is how to store it. You have it accessible when there's sun. When it's gone, you don't. So one of the things these people have started looking into is using the power, using solar power to fill up these old mines, like mines in the ground, right? Deep mines that were dug, fill them with water. And so basically what you've done is you've used the energy to lift this water into this state where there's a tension there, and that you slowly then release that water through and use it for turbines or whatever to have access back to that energy, right? So it's basically like a battery. You're using water to hold the tension, hold the energy in this big hole, and then you slowly release it to re-access that energy. And that there is a way that that's the sort of a lot of how we might experience our own minds and hearts, and the energy that we use to go about our lives is sort of like this energy that has built up, this sort of sense of potential tension, this tension of potential energy, where we're sort of storing it and using it, and every sort of experience that we have that kind of rebuilds it, the sense of that it's stored in the mind, stored in the body, and it's powerful, but it's also tense, right? I think what I like about that is the sense of just like this giant chasm filled with water, and there's something very, to me, palpable of the tension in that, right? And this may be relatable in terms of how the heart lives and goes through life and has stored up experience in this way of uh, and that's the energy we use to go through life so much of the time, is this sort of stored tension from uh, dissonance with reality, dissonance with life as it's been expressed. And so this is how we do things. This is a metaphor for the deep patterning, right, of how we tend to go about our lives, and the power and the why it's so compelling to and so yeah, compelling to live in these patterns of greed, hatred, and delusion, of clinging, of aversion, of ignorance. And so, what is the antidote, right? What is the um, how do we change this? And I think, and so this idea of like in this metaphor, right, in this sense, it's like, how do we start to build a different relationship with the dissonance, a different relationship with the musicality of the experience of seeing, of hearing, of smelling, of tasting, of body, of mind, with the waveforms of our lives that may not uh, feel like what we want them to be. But can we start to build a deepening capacity to, first of all, bear it, and then secondly, investigate it and I'll try to understand it. Try to build these sort of dual capacities, and there's more to it than that. But there is a sense of where we just, it's the practice, the word kanti, often translated as patience, is different in some ways, in many ways, from how the English word patience is often understood. I think Steve, maybe last week or a few weeks ago, was talking about kanti as forbearance, this sense of being able to bear unpleasant experience, or being able to bear the tension around pleasant experience, right? Or the tension around confusion. And so this sense of like, it's not just bearing the unpleasant or bearing the pleasant, uh, but it's bearing the tension with those things, right? Bearing the dissonance of the mind, of the wanting or the not wanting. Can we go through our lives more in a way that is actually just listening, right? And building these tools, building the ability to listen to the tones and the frequencies and the 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 music of our lives as they are, right? Rather than trying to control them, rather than trying to keep insisting on how they should be or wishing they were otherwise, or running from the things we can't, or defending ourselves from them. Where's the ability to bear it? To feel the tension in the heart, to feel the wanting things to be different. And so again, it's not just when you say it's like wanting the object, wanting the ice cream, right? It's not just sort of like, oh, can we explore the ice cream? It's like, no, it's like exploring the wanting, exploring the pain in and or the exploring the not wanting, exploring the tension with the unpleasant, the tension with the pleasant, the tension with the lack of clarity. What is it when we first get up in the morning, the first thought, can we start to observe, like, where do we go from rest, from quiet, from wherever we are, to what builds and how quickly it builds, right? Where does this sense of tension come into our lives? What gets us up out of bed? And for so many, it is this, like, one little thought arises that's like stressful, right? That starts to like get us not relaxed. And it's like that ends up being, and it's like you try to ignore it, you try to like put yourself back to sleep, you switch positions, you try to think of something else. Well, you do all these sort of games. And this question of like, okay, where can we just feel it? Where can we feel the tension of the stress, of the responsibility, of the weight, of the pressure? Um, can we come into relationship with that? And then this sort of like exploration of it. Why is it so hard? What is it? What is it that's so hard about the tension? Not sort of what's so hard about the thought and the idea and the thing that we're thinking about, but just the tension in the mind in itself and that sense of dissonance. What is it that's so difficult to be with? And actually, kind of like as Michelle was just saying, sometimes it's just sitting down with it or lying down with it, that there's a relief, right? Just sitting sometimes can bring the sense of relief. We're not running from it. We're not trying to fix it. We're not trying to manipulate it. We're just sort of being with it. And there's a relief in that, even if it's a painful experience, even if it's an unpleasant experience, there's a relief in the honesty and sometimes a sense of the capacity to bear it, right? To say, it's like, oh, actually, I can be with this. I don't need to get rid of it. I don't need to run from it. I don't need to solve it. I don't need to resolve it. I can be with the tension because you're interested and because we don't want to be totally susceptible to these things and have them be the driving forces of our lives. And then we explore it, we start to see again these classical things of the impermanence, the unpleasant, the longing of the heart, all of the classic Dhamma teachings. And it's like, okay, do we then maybe have access to a different inspiration to motivate our actions? Oh, care, compassion, equanimity. Is there a sense of like, okay, this is okay, and I'm still going to get up. I'm still going to get out of bed. I'm still going to do my things that I have to do. But the transformation of what's the motivation of finding some other place that we can come to is very powerful and classic understanding. We think about sila, samadhi, panya, ethical conduct, concentration, wisdom, these foundations of the spiritual path. In the Visuddhimagga, there it's the one place that's very interesting. It's like how do these things uproot the defilements? Sila does it through, ethical conduct does it through um, supplanting, right? So, like, instead of this, we can do this. Instead of having it be anger, we can come from love. Instead of having it be from wanting, we can have it come from compassion or wisdom, equanimity. This sense of we've made a determination and we find a different place, right? We have put something else in its place, and that there is a strength in that ability and that deepening ability to um, bring in something else. Concentration does it through suppression, right? So if you look at this other possibility in our daily lives, not just in formal practice, but when you slow down, when you bring the attention closely to lifting, moving, placing, when you are very concentrated on moving the arm, reaching for something, you see that there is a way that the mind has concentrated its efforts, and so that a certain frequency becomes the dominant thing, right? That it's not like we're getting rid of, it's not like we're really attending to all of the tensions that might be overwhelming us. There's a way that it is a suppressive frequency, right? It's like we're going to focus on this and we're going to build it. It's like wind blowing on the ocean, developing the sense of frequency of like a swell that builds right towards the shore. This very powerful energy of kind of regular and regulative um, uh, undulations of attention. And then Panya, wisdom, does it through uprooting, through cutting, through understanding, right? This deeper sense of like, we're not just suppressing tension, we're not just suppressing all of the uncontrollability in life. Ultimately, we're doing that enough to create some stability so that we can observe all of the wild frequencies of experience, of existence, and understand them and find this sense of deeper attunement, not needing to control, not needing to run, not needing to hide, not needing anything, but this deepening ability to see things as they are. It uproots the tendency toward tension, right? It's like understanding that all phenomena are impermanent, understanding that they're undependable, impersonal. It breaks the underlying habit, the need for resolution, the need for satisfaction in the sense experiences. This idea of, in this way, everything in tune. And so you can see that there's a very different energetics that drives our lives, right? This idea that the arahant isn't storing the tension from dissonance. That's not the fully enlightened being. The the even in moments where we feel much more peaceful, much more at ease, much more caring, much more connected with these beautiful qualities of mind, we see that the same actions can be taken from a very different place, and that there's a natural flow of energy, a natural impulse toward the wholesome, toward the easeful, towards the beneficial, not not forcing the mind to be like we want it to be, not forcing the world like the mind wants it to be, but this sense of kind of amplified, expanded harmonics, right? The sense of, oh, that there is the dissonance itself is no longer occurs. There is not a countervailing force of the mind against what is happening, a preference that is underlying the tension with life as it's unfolding in our moments of experience. And then what is available is understanding, patience, kindness, generosity, peace. How beautiful a sense of attunement that is. So maybe I'll just close there and encourage this sense of just a reminder that our lives are never going to ultimately be about resolving all the tensions. There's no way to resolve all the tensions, not in the world, but not even in our own lives. The our past, our the realities, the nature of experience is always going to be uncontrollable waves within just these six sense experiences. And there is simply no way that they are always going to be in perfect alignment and perfect harmony. It's not possible. And so to remember that this spiritual path is not about fixing that. It is not about coming to resolution and enforcing resolution on the world, on our senses, on our lives, on the body, on the mind, but rather expanding the sense and understanding the experience of dissonance, understanding the experience of tension. And a lot of it is just watching the desire for resolution and watching ourselves fulfill it, watching ourselves go for it, watching ourselves try to satisfy it, watching ourselves try to run from it. It's the only way that this happens. Maybe I will say this last thing. Michelle and I last week, for the first time in a few years, visited this mountain, Mauna Loa. You can drive up to about 11,000 feet and did a little hiking up there. And it is just the quietest place. There is just nothing but rocks. It's just this incredibly dynamic but very barren feeling landscape, right? At that height, there's nothing growing. It's just quiet, but so peaceful. And this sense of like how much eruption has had to happen over millions of years to get to that place, right? It's just like, because that's all it is eruptions. It's the detritus of incredible eruptions of violence, of flow, of life and of death and of explosive energies, of creation and destruction. And it only gets that way, right? At that altitude and that massiveness, right? It's considered to be the largest mountain in the world from its base in the ocean. That it takes time to get that quiet. And even there, there's still, there are actually places where the water's seeping through these lava fields, and there's caves and there's caverns, and there's definitely some life going on there, or deep caverns that go, miles into the earth where the breath of sulfur is still noticeable. And there are still, this isn't nibbana, it's deep equanimity. And it's such a relief, and it's so powerful. And there is still potential energy underneath there, right? It is due to erupt. But to have some experience of that quietude is so refreshing, right? Because we can't always get it internally. So there is something about cultivating the experience externally, understanding it in that way, and integrating it into our practice of where do you find that sense of rest, and where can you find some conditions in your life that remind you of the power of quiescence, of quietude, of this deep rest, and remembering the relief of that in a way that's very different than the relief of satisfaction or the relief of resolution of tension, but the quietude of equanimity, the quietude of peace, in this very deep way, and knowing that the only way we get there is through these undulations, through feeling it, through these constant eruptions in our lives. And the tumult is what gets us there. But it's only if we have the tools and enough of the conditions that help keep us supported in the exploration, right? That managing the voltage and intensity of the dissonance, of the tension, so that we can at least learn from it and grow from it. And when we can't, of doing all the things that we've talked about before around sort of like the skillful mitigation of the intensity of the dissonance in our lives. So now I really will leave it there. Thank you for listening, and for your practice. As usual, we have some time to take questions. If you have any questions, and we really would like to keep it at in that framework, questions about your practice, questions about Dhamma, questions about Michelle's instructions or my talk. Again, you should have a little button at the bottom of your screen that says reactions, and on there you can click a button that says raise your hand. If that doesn't work, you can just type something into the chat to let us know you have a question and we'll call on you. Hi there, Jane. Let's see, oh, I need to, hold on. Okay, now you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I have a question about inquiry. When do we do that in our mindful meditation practice? So that I have been trying to use one of the sense doors, and just when I find my mind wandering, just saying, thinking and coming back to it and doing it that way. When do we actually put in the piece of inquiry? Is it during a formal sitting practice, or is it at other times?
When you say inquiry, you mean sort of like thinking about thinking?
Yes. Or thinking about specific things that are coming up, just like what you were talking about, deepening the ability to see the tension and to do that. Do we practice doing those things during our meditation practice or at a different time when we're just sitting?
I think that the force of our conditioning to tend to want to figure things out through the thought process, that we have so little time to actually not do that when we take the time for a formal meditation, that the general encouragement is to not get involved in too much what is called discursive thinking about things in the way that you just described it and what Jesse just asked. I think what can develop from what you would call like a kind of renunciation with that, where you would tend to be trusting that there's something else happening and cooking and percolating that might be more useful in the long run if you wait. And that takes a certain amount of trust in the it's like the invisible, palpable Dhamma itself, the truth itself, and the silence, and the not doing awareness, where you might let the awareness of some aversion or anger about some tension, or the fear of some tension, or the discouragement or disappointment, that the ability to let go any kind of doing with that is so hard for us to do. So that what I would say is that if you have a choice, don't. Like, if it's really, the question is two things. One is, what's motivating it? Like, is it being really motivated out of boredom, or wanting to fix it, or like, there's all the ways that you can first explore what's motivating wanting to do that. But also, usually when we're on retreat or off retreat, and formal practice, informal practice, the question is always, do you have to? I mean, do you really have a choice? And if you have a choice, I would say in the formal practice, like we're doing here for 40 minutes of sitting, etc., I would not. And then investigation is different than the awakening factor of investigation is very different than what you're describing. The investigation is when there is enough choice and mindfulness to be able to check out the experience um, in a very different way. You know, it's exploring it not through the thought process, right?
Can you
That's
give
what,
me an example of that?
yeah, sure. Like the sound of my voice right now. If you were kind of doing a formal practice and you know you're just aware of the sound, maybe that's not a great example. Say it's the sound of the wind. Is there any sound in your home right now or outside? Do you hear any birds or?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if there's say there's some sounds happening, um, the ability to receive those sounds directly through the ear door, where you're receiving the textures and vibrations, and then say a thought comes through the mind, oh, that's a bird. You're still not thinking about it, like there's just, oh, that's a bird. You're aware of thinking like you described, and you come back. Um, that is what I mean, that you're starting to explore the texture vibration rather than having a thought, oh, that's a bird, and then thinking about, oh, is that a robin? Oh, there's probably too many robins in my yard. I wonder how many robins there are in my yard. And I wonder if anyone's done a study on how robins are doing with climate change. And maybe I better Google if anybody's done research on, I'm really good at this. We're all good at this, right? I wonder if anyone, you know, right? And then, you know, there's this whole different level of inquiry. I'm giving kind of a non-tension example. Maybe Jesse can give another one. But do you see the difference
Yeah,
between
I do.
that?
Mhm.
And what I'm saying is that during a formal meditation practice, if you can actually restrain yourself from doing it and kind of trusting being more in that non-conceptual reality, usually what happens is you get more strength of um, caring and kindness and the intention to understand rather than to judge someone else or ourselves, like all the aspects where patience, all the aspects of the goodness of the practice are often more available to us and less motivated by greed, hatred, and delusion, so that when we do make the inquiry, we have a lot more going for us.
Mhm.
That's
Thank
the
you.
idea.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I understand it better.
yeah,
I
yeah.
also just wanted to say I listened to the radio program that Jesse did with you, and it was fabulous. It was so fun, and the music was so great.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's good to know.
I think just to add a small thing to what Michelle said of like when I was saying in my talk that like most of our actions are being fueled by this tension, right, and this sort of sense of dissonance and the lack of faith in the mind's ability to just be with what's happening. It's important to recognize how subtle that, like, that's happening at very gross levels, but also at very subtle levels. That like, and if you think about thought as action, thought actions, that is true for them as well. That most thoughts, most of our thoughts, like probably 99% of our thoughts at the least, are are being compulsively generated because of a lack of comfort in what's actually happening at the six sense stores. That it is a tool of delusion. It is an intentional distracting of the mind from what's happening into a realm that it thinks it can control, thoughts and views and opinions, and the kind of way, and you see that from the way that we just sort of keep rehearsing it, thoughts over and over again. And so to get that sense of like, when I'm like, when I say that to be sensitive to the way that our actions are fueled by tensions, this is one particular way that just can be really interesting, of just looking at the desire to think, the impulse to think, And where is that coming from? What is it, just as kind of Michelle was saying, what is it that's motivating it? And so when you come to your practice, and there are definitely times where intentional reflection on what's happening is meaningful and important, that question of what is motivating it, is it leading towards more, is it a kind of thought that's going to be like, oh, what was that, and bringing the attention back to observation, or is it a thought that leads to more speculation and more sort of conjuring of a sense of stability in the thought world, that keeps us feeling a little bit, keeps the intensity of our other sense experiences and the aliveness and the voltage of it, keeps us a little bit sort of distant and kind of dull from that. That most thought is trying to dull the intensity of life, in a way that feels like we can control it. And so, not to beat ourselves up for it, but to get, it's like, oh, where, and it'll go and kind of going back to Michelle, what is it that then brings us back to like, oh, I'm going to see if I can not do that. I'm going to see if I can come back just to the breath, just to sound, just to whatever, and bear the intensity of it and not feel like I'm needing to escape from it through thought.
I could actually, it's a great question. And I think I was just kind of exploring even what was happening in my last sitting, this past sitting today. But I think that what I notice is that often the motivation to think about a situation at length on when we're sitting is often because we're not accepting the situation. And that the impulse to kind of think about it is often an attempt to kind of figure out how to work with it, but actually it's not coming, it's often coming from aversion or wanting to fix, et cetera. So that ideally, but that's ideally, we're saying that of course we're gonna not always be able to do this, but if you can, that you see if there's a way that you at least seeing the resistance to the situation and how that's fueling a lot of the thinking. And that again, by doing somewhat what we're offering, it gives you more of a chance to understand the situation, see where we're accepting and resisting, and maybe be able to come from a kinder, more wise place with the situation. So that's kind of another way to frame it.
It's all helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Not easy sometimes.
That's true.
Tim.
I'm unmuted. Yeah, I'm simply kind of spinning off on what you all are talking about. I had done some sitting with an online sitting with another meditation center, and this teacher said at one point he was on retreat and he started thinking about the 20 greatest movies of all time, and he simply couldn't stop. And he knew that he was doing it. He knew it wasn't skillful, but he couldn't pull himself out of thinking about the 20 greatest movies of all time. I know for myself, when I get anxious, I tend to do, when I was a child, I used to do baseball statistics. And when I get anxious, this is what comes up, right? It's a way of shaping the world, which is manageable. And I guess my question, I mean, you're sort of addressing this right now, but my question is, I know I'm doing it. I know I'm doing it. I'm fully conscious of the fact that I'm doing it and that it's a sort of self-soothing thing. And yet to, I don't know what, be mindful of my body, be mindful of my breath, whatever the alternatives are. At that point, the anxiety, let's say, is strong enough that I'm going to do the baseball statistics. So I don't really, I guess that's a question. How do, or maybe you don't, maybe what you're saying is you don't need to pull yourself out of these states. If you find yourself doing a sort of self-soothing mental activity, go with it as long as you know that you're doing it. That's my question. I feel like I'm talking too much.
I don't know if I would say it that, I mean, I think there's a lot more nuances, and I think there's more choices than those two choices. So I think that when in my early years of practice, I used to have a thought pattern that actually was, I had wished it was pleasant, because at least I was getting caught in it so much. And I'd come out of it and I'd go, gosh, I wish I was thinking about something pleasant. And it was so painful, and it was a karmic knot, and it would repeat. And it never occurred to me at that point in those years that I could do some metta or compassion practice, for example. And I could describe what I used to have to do with it kinesthetically. I used to use my imagination and imagine these thoughts as clouds. They would come in, and I would drill a little hole in the cloud. You can see I always come up with sort of fun things to do. So if you're having a hard time, try to come up with a fun thing to do. So I'd drill a little hole in the cloud and kind of make some space. And I'd start sending metta through that little hole in the cloud. That's how hard, I mean, I couldn't do it directly, but I would start toward the thoughts.
Yeah.
So say they're baseball statistics of the 20 greatest movies. To me, yes, there's a need for self-soothing, but often we're forgetting that we could actually do the self-soothing for the actual distraction itself.
So to do something creative such as you did, like have metta kind of come down into
Yeah, to
cloud.
the 20 greatest movie, right? Like to actually not have to go to the body, which might not really be interested in metta right then and there, right? Like it could be that we're missing the predominant object to have kindness for, or metta, so that then again, it's not like I don't see these things as these permanent solid weather fronts. Often one can have the drill, some metta. Actually, the metta gets through, the kindness might come through, the anxiety might come up. One might be able to do some Vipassana with the anxiety and feel the sensations in the body. Maybe the statistics come back. Do you see what I mean? It doesn't have to be seen as a solid weather front. And my experience, this could be a longer answer, but my experience was that over time, by choosing this middle ground, by not doing the black and the two choices you described, but to do the middle ground actually allowed for so much more compassion and so much more metta for any way I could do it. Like if, it's like if it took kind of, for me, baseball statistics wouldn't even be a possibility. I don't know them, but you know what I mean? If it was some thought pattern that if that's the only way it can happen. For me now, of course, I can come back to the hands and the feet, go back to it. There's a lot more space to be with other things. Do you see? And that's what I would encourage anyone to do. You heard us say with Jane, it's like, can you not do this? Can you not do it? And if you cannot not get involved in it, of course don't. But if you're a little bit involved, you do much more compassion, metta. You do the Brahma Viharas more, because you understand that you actually can't totally let it go.
No, this is very helpful, Michele, because basically, to sort of summarize how I'm hearing what you're saying, is the intention is self-soothing. There's a certain strategy which may not be the most, what's the right word, skillful, but then one can direct loving kindness energy into oneself to the degree that one can receive it, and then take it from there, or something like that.
Right, so that you're not developing a pattern of aversion to this baseball statistics, right? That's gonna set up a real dynamic of a power struggle, and guess who's gonna win?
Yeah, I mean, because I tend to judge myself when I go, here I am again, I'm failing, I'm losing, this is bad, right? Yeah.
And that's not a way to go with these deep knots. Like, the way to go is always toward understanding and loving kindness, understanding and loving kindness. And some of them don't drop away very quickly. That, you know, and so there's usually the karmic knots. And so again, it's almost like that power struggle is a disaster.
Yeah.
It just
Thank you. Stay out
reinforces.
of the fight, the
Yeah,
inner
yeah,
fight.
yeah,
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
yeah,
I'll just add again
yeah.
to that reminder of like this is what you're describing is ultimately the entirety of the spiritual path. Like how do we relate to all of the conditioned patterns that we've used to soothe ourselves or survive or find
Yeah.
some stability, even though we understand that they can be very destructive. The baseball patterns, thankfully, is like not a very destructive pattern, right? But like, and so in some ways, that's sort of a cool place to kind of practice with, because it's like what's at stake there is not super high, you know, where you can have perhaps a little more sort of sense of playfulness with like, oh, here's that again, and where you can find levity. Of course, the tendency to judge ourselves might be very strong, no matter what. But it basically this idea of like, well, how do we relate to these patterns? And I think it's just, you know, everything Michele said. The other framework that I spoke about in the talk is just remembering this idea of like substituting, suppressing, and understanding as these sort of tools that we have. And so there is the sense of like substituting something else. So can we see okay, we see our pattern, we get that it's happening, and is there a sense of like, okay, bringing in caring, bringing in some compassion, bringing in a different wherever we might. It might not be for ourselves, it might be towards something else, right? Some different object. It might be towards something that's in between, like the baseball players, or right, like it might be related so that you have some that can be substituting the anxiety for something that feels more wholesome. Then we don't like the word, we don't tend to use that word suppression, but to understand the technical value of concentration, which is at times we do have the ability to concentrate on something so that we're not engulfed in something else, right? And that sometimes it might be concentrating on the anxiety itself, right? It's like actually we can feel the tension, we can feel the dissonance, we can feel in the mind. Other times it's needing to concentrate on something entirely different. Understanding that the baseball statistics is kind of a form of concentration, right? Not in the terms of technical, you know, Dhamma approach to it, but you get that's what it's doing. It's exactly what you're saying. It's building a sense of stability and sort of safety and something that's sort of kind of neutral. And there's a supportiveness in that. And what else can we concentrate on that might also build some sense of it, but that's not trying to fight it? And that's that dance of like you're just like you've both said of like a concentration that isn't at war with what's happening because you'll lose. And then ultimately the understanding of where do you, like you're saying, just watch it, not to say you just let it happen or let it rip. And that's where I think that sense of like, we don't want to be so black and white about it, but you watch these patterns and you try to understand it. You're trying to watch it in a more precise way so that like while you're not fighting the conditioning, you're trying to see it more clearly and in a more momentary way so that you see, oh, this moment of anxiety led to this fear, led to this confusion, led to coming up with this thought. And to see these cycles playing out in very sort of momentary ways is a way that the understanding then starts to break up the patterns, break up the tendency, and we develop a sense of not needing it so much. Or when it does arise, we're not so upset by it, and we're also not so engulfed by it. Anyway, so just to see how that sense of dana, sila, sila, samadhi, panya, ethical conduct, concentration, wisdom is also this sort of framework for substitution, suppression, and investigation, basically. So something else another way to frame it.
Yeah, thank you. This has been very helpful. And you're saying above all else, stay out of self-judgment, something like that.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cynthia.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
What I've been thinking about asking the question now for several days. So, and now I'm confused because it's like, where is this coming from? And it's my little dichotomous thinking thing. But I've been aware, I've been thinking about when you all talk about like combining the Brahma Viharas and the sense store meditation. And I don't know how to do that because it seems like, I mean, I know how to, if I have pain, I know how to I can bring compassion to that, at least sometimes and stuff. But when I just have sort of the open awareness kind of sense door meditation, if I start to try to bring in metta, it's like I lose track of the sense doors. And I'm experiencing, I might be able to be experiencing the sensations in my chest, but I lose track of other stuff in the process. And yeah. And it just seems like then I start thinking about momentary awareness. And is it even possible to have a moment of a sense door and a moment of metta, or are they just bang, 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 metta sense door, metta sense door? So, yeah.
Sounds great. I don't think you need to do anything. I mean, it's such a wonderful tension, and these places of uncertainty around very subtle phenomena is like great. I get maybe I don't know. I know Michelle will have some things to say too. You don't you if when you say you try to practice metta in relationship with the sense doors, but then you kind of lose, it's hard once you start feeling the sense of metta, it's hard to kind of reconnect with the sense experiences. If by that you also mean that you're feeling metta, you're getting some sense of connection with loving kindness, and losing a sense of a connection with the sense doors, first of all, that's like not a problem. Like that's great. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't, this is a tool, this is one method that can be helpful at times, but like if you have a way of practicing loving kindness, whether that's sort of formal and discernible or more sort of intuitive, and then it's like you don't need to add to it or tinker with it or change it, right? It's like go with where you feel it, and there's no problem there. It's wonderful, right? And one thing I would kind of encourage, if you really want to keep exploring it, would be perhaps not starting with the sense of the real open awareness where you have all of the sense experiences happening and then you're trying to feel metta toward them. It might be more, at times it might be more, you might feel like it's more fruitful to focus on one sense story in particular, so that you really are just going to do sound and just explore this question of what does it mean to feel kindness toward sound experiences, and is there a sense of that there's a unified experience? Is it a momentary experience that's going back and forth between mind and sound, and what other things are happening there? The answer is, if it exists, is less important than you're just like checking it out and keeping going in the experiential inquiry into it, because so amazing to be wondering about that, and to not be kind of clear totally, or that sometimes it feels like one or sometimes it feels like the other, but it will be fruitful to keep looking at it, um, and that it makes sense that if you're doing a more open kind of, all of the sense doors and finding metta to it, that it's going to be hard to keep track of any particular thread of that, and that it might very understandably turns into something more of just like the experience of metta, and you kind of maybe notice different sense experiences, but that the mind experience of metta becomes predominant, and that's just interesting, right? And good to know and good to see and to understand. Yeah. Michelle, you want to add any more to that? Oh, you're muted.
I feel like that the way this is unfolding, I agree with Jesse. It's like it's leading you into a deeper understanding of the practice and how it unfolds. So I do feel like tinkering too much with it is not a good idea. But I would offer that the more we're spending like more moments of the momentary moments, the more we're sort of in that non-conceptual flow of awareness. I think I'd be careful of trying to decide, oh, I'm going to do compassion with it now. I think it would just interrupt it. And I think that's what's happening. I think I'd be, how I think at least it works for myself is that there might be this flow of sixth sense door awareness, and I might have this idea, oh, metta, like it's like you've practiced so much that they'll like that you can see that the idea of doing metta might be part of seeing, hearing, smelling. Oh, metta, do you see? It's a flow, and then you would do it a bit and then stop. Like it's not with this style of practice. It's so fast, and it's not gonna stay a long time. It's going to be a few moments, maybe if you're lucky, or one moment, and then you might not think of metta again for 30 minutes. So that's how I would do it more, that the more you're in that kind of sixth sense door non-conceptual flow of awareness, the more confusing it will get around this kind of question. Because I think it's more, you might you'll hear me say, make an intention to be kind toward what appears at the beginning, and then you let it go, just see what happens. And then you might have a thought, oh, mudita. I'm saying it the way I am because it's kind of funny. Like it's so flowing and fast, and you're not going to make that kind of concentration with a Brahma Vihara lasts long.
Okay.
In this way, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I just want to say that this is why the question is so satisfying to us, is that this is exactly why we teach it this way. Like, this is why we're teaching the metta as integrated with the Vipassana rather than this sort of separate thing. Because you can see in the kind of tradition, it is mostly taught according to like the Visuddhimagga, which is going to be as a substitutive and suppressive force, where you do metta and you lay it on a blanket. It's like a blanket that runs over everything. And there's something very powerful and beautiful about that. But you're not necessarily learning anything in that about the nature of things, right? Where it's like, yeah, the mind can just cover everything in loving kindness, and it's just a little quieter, and it's warm, it feels good, but
Which
there's
can be
like,
nice at times.
and there's a reason why it's taught that way. It's like boom, right? And so there's a strength to that. It's not to deny that, but here's a way of like, oh, how is the quality of loving kindness or compassion or appreciative joy or equanimity cultivated and built and strengthened, and that we have access to them in ways that are also helping us understand the mind and the body and the nature of what's all going on, and strengthen our ability to do that, right? Because it does soften the mind, it does stabilize and support the mind to continue with the investigation. But it's not needing to turn off reality in order to actually do that, that it can be used as a tool to understand the nature of being and becoming and all of these things. And so it's exactly why we try to teach it this way. Yeah.
It's a wonderful question, and I think as I'm kind of tuning into it more, just again, that like when you asked about momentary, it's like say there's an unpleasant physical sensation in your hand, and that might be tightness, and then then there's a thought, oh, metta for this. That sensation might be already gone by the time you attempt to bring the metta to it. Do you see? And that's what Jesse's saying, and that is so opposite that blanket of, so it's like this, it's more like sometimes the awareness itself will be colored by kindness, or it might be more neutral, it might be colored by equanimity, but it would be much, anything you would attempt to bring like compassion to might already be gone. Yeah, so it's great, cool. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you both.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, friends.
Yay, great to see everybody. Yay.
Yeah, wonderful to be with you all.
I like that feeling of, well, we made it through another week. Yippee. We're still here. Have a great week.
All right, take care. We'll see you all next week, hopefully.